We'll have Emily Argo, who is also a 2017 Knauss Fellow at the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center at USGS. Emily is originally from Massachusetts and received her bachelor's in human ecology from College of the Atlantic and her master's in environmental conservation from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 2016. So let's welcome Emily.
Thanks, Maggie, for the intro. So I'm actually going to talk about something a little different, something I've been doing as part of my Knauss Fellowship this year. So this is one of the projects I've been working on. So I'll start by acknowledging my co-authors, my supervisor, Abby, my colleague, Bonnie Myers, as well as our acting associate director, Doug Beard, and Ian, who's at the University of Hull over in the UK, and Steve Cook, who is at Carleton up in Canada. So this work actually came out of a paper, a comment they received on a manuscript a few years ago. They were addressing the inclusion of inland fisheries in general fisheries statistics and decision-making process. And someone had made a comment on the paper saying, well, we already put a lot of money towards X or Y type of fishery. And they started looking at the literature and realizing we don't actually have a quantitative method to establish how much we're spending on marine versus inland fisheries. There actually aren't any parameters, there weren't any statistics, nobody had ever really tried to quantify that. And as I'll get to in a minute, because it's kind of challenging to do. But that was part of this project and where that came out of. So I don't really have to explain, I guess, the importance of fish or fisheries to this crowd, but I'll just cover a couple pieces here. As of 2013, fisheries made up 17% of the animal protein that's consumed globally. And then capture fisheries account for 81.5 million tons from marine waters and 11.9 million tons from inland waters. They have cultural and recreational value. They also have the economic and food security component, as well as contributing to ecosystem function. So just to give you an idea of the catch and what we're working with, and bearing in mind all these statistics do come from a Food and Agricultural Organization report from 2016. So some of you are probably familiar with the debate around the quality of the data there. So with that in mind, taking a look at this figure here, which is pulled from FAO reports, and it's only looking at commercial fisheries. And so to orient you here, the x-axis is going to be the country, and for cleanliness here and ease of reviewing this, I have pulled the country names, but I will address a couple of them as we go along. Those are going to be on the x-axis, and then on the y, you have the percentage of the total catch for that country that comes from inland waters. So that will be the orange, and then the gray bars will be from the marine systems. So if you look, I have a dotted line cutting through part of this graph, and at the top you'll see it says developed will be on the left-hand side, and then developing will be on the right-hand side. And these classifications are how countries were identified within the report. So if you look at the developed side, so the left-hand side here, you'll see that most of this is gray bars coming from the marine environment, with a few exceptions. One of them being Romania here, which has a much higher proportion of inland catch compared to marine. But if you do look at a map of Romania, that's probably not a shock given the coastline compared to inland waters. And also just to note on that, none of these numbers have been standardized by area or coastline or anything like that. It's part of the project. Then here is the United States falling right along that dotted line there. And so we have mainly marine catch, and the inland catch that is represented here is strictly coming from the Great Lakes. So just to keep that in mind when you're looking at these numbers. And then when you look at the right-hand side where you have the developing countries, you see a much larger amount of orange, so inland catch. So inland fisheries playing a much more important component potentially of their fishery in developing nations compared to developed, I guess, in the US. So that's also feeding into the importance of being able to evaluate and quantify how much we are investing compared to the economic impact of our fisheries. So our research goal was to quantify investment in inland and marine fisheries relative to their economic impact with a method that could be applied in developing and developed countries. So I'll just briefly touch on what we've come up with, and then I'll expand on this in more detail later on in this talk. So for investment, we are using the proxy of jobs to represent this, and that includes in the fisheries sector that includes administration, management, enforcement, and research. And then economic impact takes into account catch sales, equipment purchases, permits and licensing, and income generated from the fishermen, or for the fishermen. Just to give you an idea of how we got to this method and what we've kind of worked through and where we're running into challenges, and I'll definitely, at the end, I welcome any feedback or comments or where we could get data would be appreciated as well. So we started out thinking we would be able to do some case studies. So a couple developing nations. So we had looked at the US, Australia, Germany, Vietnam, and Brazil, and we had included commercial, recreational, and aquaculture fisheries. And so we wanted to include statistics such as catch, management investment, license revenue, as well as the value of the catch. It quickly became clear that doing this broadly at a country scale was going to be rather challenging because you have regional and state level differences in terms of regulations, particularly relevant when you have recreational fishing. I was seeing differences, like even just in Germany, then the territories there, how those are regulated is going to be different. So we tried to step it down just to looking at state or territory within a country, and just finding that that was much more challenging to be able to get the data we were looking for. Additionally, catch value here at the very bottom of this list is a challenging thing to get because you actually need a willingness to pay survey to evaluate the value of something like a recreational fishing endeavor. So getting those numbers for the space you want is going to be challenging, or at the scale we wanted. That just wasn't really possible. We do have that for some areas and some regions, but we really couldn't apply what we were calling value on a broad scale. So that's part of how we got to economic impact as opposed to economic value, and using the different terminologies. And part of that was long discussions with economists at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We were using some of their data, so I've spent extensive time talking with one of their economists there, who's been a really great help as to the correct use and terminology differences that we often use as biologists and researchers that are not the same in economics literature. The other challenge here was management investment and how we put parameters around that. Do we include research funding that's coming from universities? Do we include nonprofit investment? Do we just include federal funds? How do we put barriers around that? Discovering that was quite challenging, and you could easily say, oh, well, are we including this? And if we're doing research, is that contributing to management? And that component getting very, very much into a gray area. So we nixed this one, and we also overall pulled out aquaculture because we were, and this is kind of something I've definitely received some questions about on this discussion, but aquaculture here in the USA, we don't have a lot of marine aquaculture. And then what we were finding is, it's regulated a little bit differently, and we also didn't want to include the ornamental fish trade, which, say if you look at aquaculture in Florida, that is the main proportion of their aquaculture, is all going towards aquarium trade and ornamental fisheries. So we wanted to make sure we could exclude that, and also there being a lot of private funding going towards aquaculture that we weren't going to be able to appropriately quantify. So we ended up removing that and just focusing on recreational and commercial fisheries. And we started by using the salary paid to people that are managing or helping run a fishery, so in the administrative enforcement, research, as well as management more broadly component, but realizing that getting salary numbers can be a bit touchy, maybe just comparing states within the US, one state pays their people more than another, and that not being a number people would necessarily like to provide to us. So that's how we came up with the use of jobs as a proxy for investment. And then economic impact would come from catch sales, equipment purchases, permits and licensing, and income, as I said before. Now, we are looking at, to address the investment in jobs piece, and where we have income on the economic side. So you can see how that can be a little confusing. The income component of the economic impact is only looking at the income given to fishermen or people doing any kind of guiding, that type of income. It doesn't include someone from a state or federal agency's income for managing the fishery. So that's why we are just looking at, here on the left for jobs, state and federal agencies and the jobs they put towards management of these fisheries. So that's how we ended up with jobs on one side, and then income is strictly what's being generated from the fisheries itself. So for the state level, this would not include, obviously, the federal management agencies. That's going to be either regionally based or nationally based. So at a state level, we're only looking at state, marine, and inland fisheries agencies. And then when we do a national assessment for something like the US, that would take into account an agency like NOAA. And then economic impact for marine, we're using the National Marine Fisheries Service Fisheries Economics of the United States reports, which are produced annually. And then for the recreational side, we're using the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey's National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation. They collect data on how much people are spending, how many fishermen or women that there are, what people are spending on trips and licensing, and then they pull in the income piece and they calculate the economic impact of these recreational fisheries. Then on the inland side, it looks like we're going to have to be getting the data on the commercial fisheries. For like Great Lakes coastal states would have to come from the states themselves. And then recreationally, we are also using the Fish and Wildlife Service survey. We are aware that NOAA does do their own marine recreational fishing survey. I had a conversation with one of the economists here, and following that conversation and some further discussion with my collaborators, we decided to just use the Fish and Wildlife Survey because it's done consistently across both of them and done in the same year pattern, whereas the marine recreational survey done by NOAA may not necessarily fit the exact same time frame, and therefore comparing them would have its challenges. So we chose just to go with the Fish and Wildlife Survey here. So just to give you an example, and this is preliminary data of what we could do with something from a state like Maine, what numbers we would be getting. So on the marine side, for both the commercial and recreational management, looking online at their website, I ended up finding that they had 30 people listed there as focusing on fisheries on the marine side, and then pulled up economic impact numbers, and these are from the year 2011, and that's because that is the most recent year I have state level data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service survey. They did run one in 2016, but we are still waiting on the state level data. And then on the inland side, pulling from the website, 130 people listed, and then the economic impact numbers here. That being said, I think there's a lot we're missing by just looking at the website data, because obviously there's technician or part-time positions that are not going to be accounted for in those numbers. They were primarily higher level. So reaching out to state level contacts is how we're going to be having to go about doing this at the state level. So just one possible analysis method we were looking at was a type of linear regression. So comparing the investment, so the number of jobs on the x-axis, to the economic impact on the y for inland and marine fisheries. And if there's no difference between the slopes of those lines, then there's no difference in terms of how we're investing in the fisheries. However, if we do find a difference, then that's telling us that we have a different investment compared to economic impact. So looking ahead, we're trying to identify a method to incorporate contract employment into those investment numbers, because at an agency like NOAA, so much of that is done using contract employees potentially, and we don't have a good number or a good way to get that number as of yet. Then also finding a source for consistent Great Lakes commercial fishing data, as well as any other inland commercial fishing data throughout the US we could use. Then we have to move through and finish collecting this information. This will hopefully be a job for someone else who is coming through our office. So the idea here being I can set it up so that they have basically a database that they'll be able to populate. And then we want to expand our collection globally for both developed and developing countries. So we have collaborators who work with many people in different countries that are hoping to be able to get us some of the data moving forward. So I just want to acknowledge Richard Aiken at the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's been a wonderful help as I've been having some questions throughout the year on how to go about this. Sabrina Lovell here at NOAA, And then my supervisor, Abby, and my colleague, Bonnie, have been supervising me throughout the year. And then Judy and Matt at Woods Hole, my host program. So I'm happy to take any questions moving forward. Thanks, guys. No questions. Yeah.
No question, but in the Great Lakes fishing data, so you need that. I see down to a lot of the Great Lakes, maybe we can see if anyone there knows of
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, Sea Grant would be a great source for the commercial fishing data for us. Absolutely.
Do you go back to your slide where you have the correlation of inland?
That one?
Yeah, so you're saying there's no difference in this, or there is difference between the slope that you brought in here between inland and marine fisheries. What does that slope really tells us?
Okay, so what the question, I don't know if people online are able to hear this, is explaining kind of what the slope would be telling us here in the analysis. So basically the slope would be telling us how our economic impact on our investment are relating to one another. So if your kind of investment is proportional to the economic impact of.
So does that mean inland fishery has more efficient economic impact than the marine fisheries?
And the data that I've plotted here is absolutely theoretical. There are no numbers behind this. This figure is purely me throwing things on and being like, all right, 2 slopes, go. There is no data behind this. This is not meant to indicate we have found a particular relationship at this point. This is what we would do once we have either multiple states or multiple countries to put on here. So that's not saying that's what we expect to find. That's just what I did when I put it together. Yeah, Emily.
So related to that, I wanted to ask you, take a wild guess at what you are expecting to find. Will there be a difference between?
Oh, to take a wild guess at what I think we're going to find. I think it's possible we're going to find some differences. I think it depends on, in many cases, like within the US, you're going to have some states where recreational fishing is going to play a really big part. And so it's going to be, I think, a question of if data is getting skewed by this really high value fisheries in some places. And I think that'll be one of the things, being able to do this with the US and kind of look at the states individually and then see the national scale component as well, because it doesn't, and it might not be able to break down once you get outside of the US what might be the dominant factor influencing that. So I think it's possible we're going to see some differences, but I'll be curious to see, getting through the US data, if things kind of even out, or if it does, if you do see the influence of those states that have the high importance of particular fisheries. Because keeping in mind that I have yet to be able to find this, and I brought this up when I did a test round of we chatted about this in my lab group yesterday, data not being standardized by like the inland water area you have available. I could not find data for inland waters. You could get like river miles and things like that, but I couldn't get area of, say, lakes as well to pull in to do a standardization of anything besides, like, say, a coastline. But you're still, with commercial fisheries, going beyond that out into more water. So finding a way to standardize that is not something that I've been able to take into account in the way I would like to. And kind of the idea with the method here being broad enough to capture a lot of things, because obviously in an ideal world you'd have all these very specific components of data and can pull in catch and all of this as well. But getting that at the scale we want was just, we learned very quickly, goes down a rabbit hole and makes it pretty challenging. So we can't separate it out as much as I might like, but hopefully this will get us started and then kind of feed to the next round of getting a finer scale.
Yeah, well, even what you're saying, standardizing by the area of the water, that is a whole paper in itself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, doing a standardization for that would be for inland water would be great to have, but yes, would also be a whole other piece unto itself.
How do you guys, and when you guys are able to finish this project, how do you guys use the data?
How do we want to use the data? So the idea being kind of the primary impetus for this was having a way to just simply quantify and be able to say we are investing more here or more here, and how we're doing that as to what, say, a manager would make a choice in terms of their decision making. That would be kind of giving them a tool to maybe help them along that road, but also recognizing that this does not necessarily capture as many details as we might like. So we're trying to work with what data that we have available to us that we could ask in other countries, or simply have a very clear ask. We are looking for this number and this number and this number, and do that. But yeah, just to have a way to quantify and to start there moving forward.
We have an online.
Awesome, online question. Okay.
Roger is asking, I thought the fisheries tracked marine fisheries related jobs, in addition to the landings and value information reported in the annual fisheries of the U.S. report. Do you have that job info? Can you explain again why you decided to only use management jobs, which is obviously different than the industry or jobs?
Yeah, we are including, so the question online is asking about inclusion of jobs for it. So making sure I'm understanding the question correctly, that the jobs in industry tracking the jobs in management. And yes, I think that is something to be taking into consideration. We have chosen to use jobs from the management side because those incomes and that value is not included in the economic impact numbers. Like the value generated for, say, a fisherman or someone at processing a fish, that income and that piece is included in the economic impact side. So that's already in those numbers. So I think there is going to be something to consider statistically when we look at that. Absolutely. And people are welcome to shoot me emails with more questions if they have them as well.
Can you remind me what the income portion of the economic impact, what you learned?
Yeah. So the income portion of the economic impact, so I'm just going back to this one here. So income is going to include income from processing or from sale of catch. That would be someone participating as a fisherman or processing on that side of the industry. And then the jobs component is purely on the management side. So that was how we chose to split it up, because the management component was not taken into account in those economic impact numbers from my discussions with economists.
Seems to me that a lot of this data is there, but secret.
If there is data, that would be great. I have a lot of the federal component, but in terms of employment numbers, if Sea Grant has it, that would be great. if you have or a link to that data, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
What about like capital investment in terms of processing plants and vessel fleets, that kind of thing? Is that incorporated in the
So as far as the inclusion of capital investment, we have not included that here. And that was part of where figuring out what parameters to place around it became challenging in terms of like offering incentive programs for purchase of gear or anything like that. That has not been taken into account.
So I'm just wrapping my head around like the ultimate goal question. So because your investment is structured as, and I'm understanding it, the management jobs is the investment portion of what you know?
Yes, yeah. So it's going to be the management side, so including.
Is what is government investing in these markets, and that's why you're not taking, or that's why you're only looking at those because of the impact elsewhere, right? So ultimately the question is more like how can the state or federal government invest to achieve?
Yep. So this is we are only looking at kind of the government level investment as far as jobs go, as opposed to bringing in, because you also have nonprofits or universities that are doing research that are contributing to all of this. And we quickly discovered, just looking at university budgets or looking, that we could not parse out moving forward those numbers well enough. So that's how we ended up just focusing on the state and federal level jobs for that. Yeah, recognizing that there are a lot of other pieces that contribute to that, just not being able to include them in a consistent way.
Since you're looking at only like commercial and recreational, and what about islands or small countries that have a lot of subsistence fishing and get a lot of their livelihoods from there? Are you going to like recognize those gaps or talk about, or what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, what are we going to do about the gaps with subsistence fishing? And that's absolutely correct. There's a lot of numbers that we just don't have data for, that are just not going to be able to be encompassed in here. So yes, we would absolutely be recognizing that as one of the gaps, especially once you get into a lot of developing countries as well. And then inland fisheries generally, because they're so dispersed, tend to be challenging to really quantify and get that. So unfortunately, there will be some data that just we won't be able to capture with this method simply because we don't have it. It'd be great if we did. Yeah.
First, I just want to acknowledge how difficult it is to evaluate the economic impact. There's a lot of issues, like the quality issue, and also I want to mention another thing is the time lag. You take that into consideration, the time that you invest this money, but the time you get the impacts are like 20 years later.
Absolutely.
You take that into account.
So the question is addressing the time lag of this. So in an ideal world, we would actually be able to do this as I have a time series, because we do have, at least within the US, we do have the Fish and Wildlife Survey conducted every 5 years, and Canada does do a similar survey every 5 years as well. So the idea would be to have it eventually form a time series where you might be able to suss out if there's a lag in some of this potentially. But yes, that would be a challenge as well with economic impact and just looking at a specific time point. So ideally, it would turn into a time series. So we're starting here. But yes, ideally, we would be able to capture those changes as well. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.